Now that you've generated your final frontier, it's time to start completing the table that will help you determine the weights to place in each of your 5 stocks and, well, to actually achieve a couple of dominant points on your red frontier. And your red frontier will probably not have the same shape as my red frontier. But this red frontier represents the optimal, well, I shouldn't say optimal, but the leftmost points that we can achieve by combining the 5 stocks that make up my portfolio. And it doesn't necessarily include all 5 stocks. Some of the stocks might not be worthy of inclusion based on their return and their standard deviation and their co-movement. So I have the Final Frontier portion of the project up here. I've generated my Final Frontier. That's on a different video. Now, the second part says plot the portfolio's annual arithmetic mean and standard deviation on the graph and label that point the actual portfolio. So on my frontier graph, I'm going to click on the plot area, right-click and select data, add a point, and I'm going to call it actual portfolio. I'll be using this series name as my label in a little bit. And the X value is the annual standard deviation. My portfolio's annual standard deviation was 29.23. And the arithmetic mean is my Y. It was 41.65. And there is my square that represents my actual portfolio. And even though it's labeled on the legend, I would really prefer to have it on the graph itself. So I'm going to right-click it, add data labels. It has chosen the arithmetic mean as the data label, which is not what I want. So I'm going to format my data label and tell it to use the series name and not the Y value. So I'm going to check this label contains series name, and I'm going to uncheck Y value. And I can drag this so it is a little more readable, although that didn't necessarily help a whole lot. The next part says plot the annual risk-free rate on the frontier graph and label this point RF. I'm using a risk-free rate of 3%, which is not the same as what you're using. But to add that risk-free rate, I again right-clicked on the plot area, and the plot area is just this area that I'm drawing, following with my cursor. It's the area of the chart that actually contains the data versus axes, names, and legends. So you right-click it, choose Select Data, Add. I will label this RF, and it has an X value, which is the standard deviation of 0, and a Y value, in my case, of 3. It will be different for you. And I'm going to right-click this orange triangle, add data labels, right-click it again, format my data labels to include the series name but not the Y value. And I actually don't like where it's positioned. I could drag the label, but another way to adjust the label is to right-click the dot, format data labels, and then choose the label position. And here I'll just click left. And it didn't actually change because I'd already dragged it to the left. Now I want to choose a point on my final frontier that would have offered better return for the same risk achieved by the portfolio and label this point X. I also then want to, well, let's do that first. I want to find a dominant point on the red frontier that would offer the same risk but better return than my actual portfolio. You can see my portfolio fell far to the right of the red frontier, which offers the optimal or I should say the lowest risk for various return levels. So I could have generated the same risk of 29.23, but a much better return way up here. So What I'm going to do is add a point that will accomplish that for me. And there are a couple of ways I could do that. I can just eyeball it. The only thing I know, the only thing I know about this point directly north of my actual portfolio is it has the same risk of 29.23. And actually, just by hovering my cursor over the red line, it's giving me coordinates for that point. I can see that a portfolio with the same risk, 29.22396,481, would have generated a return of 72.95. So I'm just going to jot that down. And again, I got that by just hovering my cursor over the point on the red line directly north of my actual portfolio. And if you look closely at what that tip is saying, like here it was a little bit too far to the left, and it decreased the standard deviation to 28.74. I want to Sorry, I get interrupted by knocks at my door, and I have to pause, and now I don't remember where I was exactly, so hopefully I'm picking up from approximately the same point. Okay, by holding my tooltip or my cursor over the point directly north of my actual portfolio that lies on the efficient part of the frontier, I can figure out the return of a portfolio that has the exact same risk as my current portfolio. So by hovering my cursor over it until I see a point that says the same standard deviation, which was approximately 29.23, I can tell it has a return of 72.95. So I'm going to add that point into my plot area by right-clicking my plot area, selecting data, add. This point I'm going to call X, and it's going to have a standard deviation of 29.23 approximately. It's not quite that, and a return of 72.95. And you can see it landed right on that red frontier. Now I don't actually want an X to be my data marker, so I'm going to right click it. I'm going to format my data series and go to marker options, and I'm going to use a built-in circle to represent my point X. I'm going to right click that point, add, oops, I clicked the wrong thing, add data labels, right click it again, format data labels, and I'm going to choose my series name and uncheck Y value. So now it says X. Popping back to the Word document with the instructions, it says label this point X, which we've done, and it asks what weighting scheme is required of the 5 stocks to accomplish point X, and it wants me to put that information down here in this table. Well, to determine that, you can't see what I'm about to click because this portion of the screen isn't being recorded, but this spreadsheet has several tabs. One is labeled Frontiers, and this is the Frontiers tab. The other is labeled EF, which is where the spreadsheet is getting all the data to generate the red part of that frontier. Here I have my standard deviations, my expected returns. This is something I just needed to check and figure out why my macro wasn't working, so you can ignore column C. But in columns D through H, it tells me the weight that I need in each of my 5 stocks to generate the red frontier. Well, what I know about my point X is it has a standard deviation of about 29.23. So what I'm going to do is just go down the standard deviation column until I find one that's equal to approximately 29.23. And here it is. There's that return of 72.95. And in columns D through H, there's the weight that I need in each of my 5 stocks to accomplish point X. I want to just copy that information into Word. And you can see I actually set up a little table to do that before, but I'm going to delete that and repeat it. So what I'm going to do is just highlight these weights and then Control C, and then just over here to the right, I'm going to choose a cell and click and say Paste Special, and I'm going to paste values and transpose because my Word document has all of my information vertically, where here all of my information is horizontally, and I just want to transpose that and switch it from being horizontal to vertical. So here's the weight that I need in each of my 5 stocks, and I would also like the tickers. So I'm going to highlight my tickers here, come back down here, right click the cell next to my weights, paste special, values, and transpose. I'd also like these formatted as percentages and carried out to 2 decimals so they look nice. So to accomplish point X, here's the weight I need in each of my 5 stocks. And just as an aside, you might have some 0% weights here. It just depends on your stocks. But now that I've highlighted this section, I'm going to copy it and pop over to my Word document. And I actually had worked this later, or not later, earlier, and it just has some information in it from before, and it's the information I need, but I want to just show you how I'm pasting everything. I think before it said stock 1, stock 2, and so on. But this is the section where I want to paste the information from Excel that I just copied. So I highlight all these cells and I just press Control V, and it will paste my tickers and my weights. Now to calculate my dollar amounts, I'm going to pop back into Excel and just talk a little about point X first. Point X does not involve any borrowing or lending. I haven't yet added that capital market line or the lending borrowing line. So point X just involves taking my $50,000 and weighting it however Excel has decided to accomplish point X using these weights. So the dollar amount that I would have invested in each stock would be the 50,000 times the weight that's needed to accomplish point X. So here are the dollar amounts that I need to have in each stock for point X. And I'm just going to format that as a dollar amount. And I'm going to Control C, pop over to Word, highlight these 5 cells, and Control V to paste my dollar amounts. Now point Y is a point on the frontier, the final red frontier, that would have earned lower risk but the exact same return as my actual portfolio. So popping back over to my chart, basically it's saying choose a portfolio that would generate the same return but lower risk than my actual portfolio. So go to your actual portfolio point, move directly left until you hit the red final frontier, and I'm just holding my cursor over this red frontier until I get to a return of approximately 41.95, and that's the second point in the tip. So it says series efficient frontier point 15.04, etc. And then it gives me the XY coordinates. X is the standard deviation, Y is the return. So the second number, or the Y, is what I'm looking at. Then, and it's the 41.95. So I could have generated my point Y with a return of 41.95 and a standard deviation of 15.05. So I'm going to add that point to my frontier by right-clicking the plot area, selecting data, add, I'm going to call this Y. It has a standard deviation of 15.05, and a return of 41.95. And you can see it's added the point right here. I'm going to add data labels. I'm going to format those data labels to include the series name and not the actual numerical value. And then I'm going to format the data series and change my marker options again to the built-in circle just because that's what I like. And there's point Y. Now I also want to track the weights needed to accomplish point Y and the dollar amounts to invest in each of my 5 stocks for point Y. Now these are just the same tickers, so I'm just going to highlight these tickers, copy, and paste them. And now I'm going to go back to Excel and look up the appropriate weighting scheme for point Y. Point Y is quite a bit different than point X over here. Your difference might not be so great. For instance, if your portfolio had plotted right where my cursor is, the difference between the weighting scheme of your point X and Y wouldn't be that drastic, because point X would be directly north of your cursor, point Y directly east of your, actually that would be west, west of your cursor, and you can see there wouldn't be much difference. It'd be about from here to here. So your weighting scheme wouldn't change that much. My weighting scheme is going to probably change quite a bit because there's a big difference between my X and Y. To find my point Y, again, I know you can't see what I'm about to click on, but I'm clicking the EF tab in my spreadsheet. And what I know about my point Y, here's my standard deviation column. I know it has a standard deviation of 15.05. I also know it has a return of 41.95. So I'm just going to go down the return column B until I find 41.95. There's that 15.05 standard deviation. Here are my weights then that apply to each of my 5 stocks. So I'm going to Control C to copy those weights. Pop back down here to this little table that I'd built earlier. Put my cursor on the first weight, right click, and paste special, values transpose. So it has adjusted my weights, and you can see now I have 54% in McDonald's. I'm not quite sure what the weight was before. We'll check it in just a minute. Point X still does not involve any borrowing or lending. It's just taking your $50,000 and reallocating it in a different weighting scheme. So I can still use the same equation, take my $50,000 and multiply it by my weight to tell me how to allocate my money. Since I copied my tickers earlier in my Word document, I only need to copy my weights and my dollar amounts. So I'm highlighting them, Control C, popping over to Word, highlighting the cells I want to paste them to, and Control V. And let's just take a glance at the difference in the weighting scheme. It's quite different. From 36% in Cirrus Logic down to 22%, from 42% in Ruger down to 13%. Not a huge change in Green Mountain, but definitely a huge change in McDonald's, from 12.5% to 54%. So definite changes in how I should allocate my money dollar-wise too, obviously. The next question says, using the provided annual risk-free rate, in my case that's 3%, but you'll have something different, and the Insert Shapes line feature of Excel, add the capital market line to your final frontier graph and label the tangency point T. And then determine the weighting scheme for T. So go to your chart. Here's my risk-free rate. And I'm going to go to Insert, Shapes, and just choose the line shape. put my cursor on the risk-free point and then hold down my left mouse button and just draw a line until it looks like it's tangent to the red final frontier. Wait, that's not tangent to my red final frontier. That's not tangent. Just move it over until it's, by eyeballing it, it's tangent to the red frontier. Mine, I know, looks like it's tangent at point Y. That is just a coincidence. Yours, it shouldn't be tangent necessarily at point Y. It might coincidentally be tangent at point Y, but that's the only reason. And I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to try to zoom in. So that you can see that it's not actually tangent exactly at point Y. It's really tangent more right about here. And so by holding my cursor over where I am eyeballing the tangency point, I see it's got a standard deviation of 12.75 and a return of 35.95. So now I need to figure out the weighting scheme to accomplish point T. And by the way, I'm going to just add that point on my graph. So select data, add another point. I'll call this point T for tangency. It has a standard deviation, or X, of 12.75 and a return of 35.95. So that's my point T. I'm going to right click it, add my data label, format my data label to contain the series name. And while I'm content with X and Y being to the right of the dot, I want the point T, it's blurring in with that green frontier, and I can't read it that well, so I'm just going to scoot it to the left. So now to determine the weighting scheme of point T, I'm going to click to the EF tab. I know my point T has a standard deviation of 12.75 and a return of 35.95. So I find that point on my standard deviation and EF section, which is right here, and then I look up the weighting scheme needed to accomplish point T. And I'm going to copy those weights, scroll back down to here, and paste special, values, and transpose. I can't actually remember if I asked for the dollar amount, so I'm going to pop back into my Word document. And here I just ask for the stock name or ticker symbol and the weighting scheme. So I'm just going to highlight my tickers and weighting scheme for point T, copy those, go to the Word document, highlight the cells I want to paste into, and Control V. And you can see my weighting scheme has changed. It has even more in McDonald's and less in everything else but Family Dollar stores. Again, you might have some zero weights here yourself. It just depends on your portfolio. So now that we have the capital market line or the lending borrowing line, we can plot a dominant point on that line that would generate the same standard deviation as the actual portfolio. And I want to call this point Super X. So go over to your chart. Here's the standard deviation. I'm going to change my zoom factor to, I guess, 140-ish. So here's my standard deviation. I want to find a point on this blue capital market line that will accomplish the same standard deviation as point X. So directly north of X will be my Super X. And because I just drew in this line, when I hover over it, I don't get any coordinates that pop up because I didn't plot this line. I drew it with the shapes feature. So go to point X. Um, Directly north of that, it looks like my return is going to be approximately 81% at a standard deviation of 29.23. So I'm going to add that in by right-clicking the plot area, selecting data, and adding a point that I will call Super X. And it will have a standard deviation the same as my portfolio of 29.23. And the Y value, again, I just eyeballed it. I said it looked like it was going to be 81%. So I can see that it did actually manage to plot almost right on that blue capital market line, which is where I want it. So I'm going to click that point X, or the new Super X, right click it, add my data labels, right click it again, format my data labels to contain the series name. And I think I'm going to move it to the left so that it's a little more easily read. And again, I just prefer dots, so I'm going to right click it again, and this time format data series, and change my marker options to the built-in circle. This linear X is a mistake. One time I accidentally clicked add trend line, and I didn't mean to, and that's what occurred. So I'm just going to delete that. That should never have happened. Now point X is obtained by, since it's on the capital market line, but it's north of the tangency point. That means I am borrowing money at the risk-free rate and investing that money plus my original $50,000 in point T, the tangency point. Now I have to figure out how much to borrow, and this we're going to have to do a little algebra. So what I know about point X, or Super X, is it has a standard deviation of 29.23, and it's formed by borrowing some money at the risk-free rate of 3% and investing that borrowed money plus all my original $50,000 into point T. And point T has a risk of 12.75 and a return of 35.95. So that's important to keep in mind. So to calculate how I'm going to allocate things to accomplish point Super X, I will be borrowing some money at the risk-free rate, of 3%, and I'll put everything in point T, which has a standard deviation of 12.75 and a return of 35.95. And then Super X has a standard deviation of 29.23, the same as my actual portfolio. So to figure out my weighting scheme and how much I'm going to borrow, so that to figure out the weight in the risk-free and the weight in point T, I'm going to use the standard deviation equation. So the standard deviation of Super X equals the weight of point T times the standard deviation of point T. It's actually that longer standard deviation of a portfolio formula, but the individual risk term for the risk-free asset cancels or goes to zero, as does that co-movement term. And then the squared parts of the individual risk term are removed when I eliminate the radical. So the Super X standard deviation is 29.23. I'm solving for the weight in the tangency point, and the standard deviation of the tangency point is 12.75. Divide both sides by 1275. That will give me the weight to put in the tangency point. And you can see that it's going to be higher than 100%. So I get 2.2926. So 229.26% of my money should be in T. 1 minus 229%, or a negative 129.26%, should be in the risk-free rate. Since it's negative, it means I'm borrowing. And then these two should sum to 100%. So essentially, I've got $50,000 of my own money. I need to borrow 129.26 more. Now I'll put that as a negative. I need to borrow $64,630. Put that as a negative because I'm borrowing it. I will take that borrowed money, $64,630, add to it my original $50,000, and that's how much I'm going to invest in point T. So I'll put 114,630 into point T. So back over to Excel. I didn't realize I had quite so much open. So here I want to know the weights in my risk-free asset. That's that minus 129.26%. It's negative because I'm borrowing. And then the dollar amounts would be the $64,630. And actually I'm going to make that negative as well because I'm borrowing. And then point T is going to be 229.26%. And the amount that I'm putting in point T will be the 114,630. Now in terms of my individual stocks, I'm popping back over to Excel to my EF tab. These are the weights that I use to accomplish point T. But instead of putting 50,000 in point T now, I've borrowed $64,630 and added it to my 50,000, so I'm putting $114,630 in point T. So copy that down and it'll take my 114,630 and just multiply by these weights to tell me the dollar amounts to put in each. So I'm going to copy these dollar amounts, and you can see that they do sum. I mean, I don't need to do this part, but they do sum to the 114,630. So copying my dollar amounts, popping over to Word, and I'm going, well, actually I need my tickers, my weights, and my dollar amounts. So I'm going to pop back to Excel, copy all of that information, and pop back into Word, highlight the cells I want to paste it to, and paste it. And you can see there's a huge difference now in accomplishing point, let's say, Super X versus just point X. Point X says put $6,292 in McDonald's. Point Super X says, hey, put $71,807 in McDonald's. And not only that, you have to borrow $64,000 to be able to accomplish point Super X. Now Super Y, oh, I've actually forgot to fill these points out as we were going along. I was just jotting them down on a sheet of paper, but point X On my chart, point X has a standard deviation of 29.23 and a return of 72.95. So I need to input that here. Point Y has a standard deviation of 15.05 and a return of 41.95. Point T has a standard deviation of 12.75 and a return of 35.95. Point Super X has a return of 29.23, or sorry, 81%, and a standard deviation of 29.23. And then point Super Y, we haven't done yet. So point Super Y is the dominant point on that blue capital market line that would have generated the same return as the portfolio. My portfolio generated a return of 41.95, so just go directly left until you hit the blue capital market line. And I'm going to zoom in again so you can see it a little better. Mine is going to be very difficult to tell. I'm actually going to try zooming in a little bit more. It's still tough to tell. So point Y does not quite lie on my capital market line. It lies a little bit to the right because my tangency point I'm saying is point T. So point Y isn't quite dominant. I'm going to add a point that I do think is dominant. So point Y has a return of 41.95, the same as my portfolio, but has a standard deviation of 15.05. So what I'm going to do is add a point that I'm going to call Super Y. It's going to have the same return of 41.95 as my portfolio, but it's going to have a standard deviation slightly less than my original point Y, so slightly less than 15.05. I'm just going to say 14.95. And I think that's actually not low enough of a standard deviation because this blue dash is to the right of the capital market line and it needs to lie right on it. So I'm going to edit my point Super Y and then change the standard deviation to, let's say, 13.95. Now it's too far over to the left, so I'm going to edit it again and we'll go with 14.5. And hopefully that will get it right on the capital market line. And it's close enough, so I'm good with that. I'm going to, because this one is essentially almost right on top of my Y dot, I'm going to leave it as a little dash, and I'm going to not change it to a circle. So what I want to do is right click it, add my data labels, right click it again, format those data labels, use the series name and not the Y value, and I'm going to switch the title to the left. So there's point Super Y, and what I know about Super Y is it has a standard deviation of 14.5 and a return of 41.95. So I'm going to go to my Word document, put in my standard deviation and the return was 41.95, standard deviation 14.5. And remember, point Super Y is formed by combining the tangency portfolio T and the risk-free asset. Since my Super Y point is north of the tangency point, it means I am a borrower. It means my weight in the risk-free asset will be negative. Because super Y is north of point T, it will have a negative weight in the risk-free asset, but it's not going to be nearly as negative as the weight needed to accomplish point super X, because super X was far north of point T. Super Y is only slightly north of point T. But I need to figure out my weighting scheme for super Y. What I know about super Y, I'm going to just change the pen color. I'm not going to erase all this because some of it I actually still want. So in blue, I'm going to solve for super X. But what I know about, what I need is this information. It's combining point T, which has this standard deviation and return, and super Y has a standard deviation of 14.5. So I'm going to use the same equation, but instead of super X, it's going to be super Y. So super Y has a standard deviation of 14.5. It's formed by weighting the tangency portfolio, which has a standard deviation of 12.75. Divide both sides by 12.75. And that will give me the weight to put in the tangency portfolio. So I'm going to just round, it's 114%. So the weight in the risk-free has to be 1 minus 114%, so minus 14%. So I've got $50,000 of my own money. I need to borrow 14%. So 50,000 times 14% is $7,000. Negative just to reflect that I'm borrowing it. Take my 50,000 plus the 7,000 that I borrowed, so the 57,000 will be allocated across the 5 assets that make up point T using point T's weighting scheme. So go back to your Word document. My risk-free asset will have that minus 14% in it. That's the a negative $7,000. Point T will be the 114%, and I don't want you to round to no decimals. Go ahead and carry it out to 2 decimals, but I was kind of in a hurry. There's the $57,000. And then my allocation scheme, go back to Excel, to your EF tab. This is the weighting scheme needed to accomplish point T, but instead of putting $114,630 in point T, I'm putting $57,000. Drag that down. This does sum now to 57,000. I highlight all 3 of these columns, Control C, pop over to Word, highlight these cells, Control V, and that's how I could accomplish point super Y.